Hello, hello, hello. Happy President's Day. We wanted to get this season started with a discussion about something critically important. And what could be more critical than the period called the critical period? But why was it so critical? Critical of what? Critical of whom? Today, we discuss America at possibly its most fragile moment, how it led to the Constitution, and how George Washington was central to all of it, with Dr. Doug Bradburn. This is Too Complicated for History, Season 2.
Today, we're joined by the John and Adrian Mars president and CEO of Mount Vernon, and also a well-known historian, Dr. Douglas Bradburn. Thanks for being here with us today, Doug.
It's great to see you guys again.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. For those of you who are just podcast listeners and don't pay attention to the rest of Primary Source Media's works, we have worked with and been at Mount Vernon several times in the last couple of years. But we're very excited to be talking to Doug today.
Yeah, and today we're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution. But what I wanted to talk about first, because I feel like it's something that we kind of ignore, or it's one of those things that you know it existed and then you move on, is the Articles of Confederation, that there was something before the Constitution. But I feel like it's not really talked about or, a part of school curriculum. So can you talk about what exactly the Articles of Confederation were and sort of what was the plan of government under them?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. What an exciting subject for this launch of your second season of your wonderful podcast, The Forms of Government. How are we governed? We are in a presidential year where we will select our new executive leader. One of the things our first situation of government didn't have was an executive, and the Articles of Confederation is what you asked me about. The Articles of Confederation are essentially, it's a treaty of friendship between 13 sovereign states, and it was our original alliance of the different states. So in this country, of course, we declared independence. So we had this thing called the Continental Congress, and it was just a group of colonies had sent these representatives, and they were, complaining to Parliament. They eventually started fighting a war against the British forces. They took over the army. George Washington was appointed a commander-in-chief. All this was done before there was any kind of formal government between all these different colonies in rebellion, essentially. So you have the 13 original British colonies in rebellion, fighting a war. And then it isn't until, of course, the June of 1776, there's a motion made by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia at the Continental Congress, and he says, I'm moving that we are, by all rights, free and independent states. And everybody agreed. Okay, that's what we'll do. And so let's draft a Declaration of Independence. Well, there's actually 3 committees that came out of Lee's resolution, and one of them drafted the Declaration of Independence, and that's the famous one that gets all the love and attention. And the other committee drafted the Articles of Confederation, an agreement of union. And in fact, for many people at the Continental Congress, that was the most important committee. Like the Declaration, yes, we got to formally tell everybody that we're declaring that we're independent. But the thing that really matters is how are we going to govern ourselves at this moment? So the Articles Committee, which is chaired by John Dickinson, I believe, Delaware's own John Dickinson, famous as the guy who wrote letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, even though he was from Delaware. Hard for the people of Delaware to celebrate that achievement. But at any rate, they're probably all Eagles fans nowadays anyway, so who cares, right? But so the Articles of Confederation came out of this committee. It was formed at the same time that we decided to declare independence, because you got to have a government. In fact, John Adams, I think, argued that you have to have a government before you declare independence. But apparently he lost that vote. And they put him on the Declaration Committee, right? So at any rate,
It would take it too long to have him on the other one, probably.
Yeah. So this one took a long time too. So basically, the Articles of Confederation weren't ratified. First of all, by the Congress, the Continental Congress agreed to the Articles. It's a series of articles which is basically saying this is a league of friendship. All the states retain their sovereignty, except in these cases, and it kind of lays it out pretty straightforward. It was agreed to by the Continental Congress in '77, I think in the fall of '77, and then it wasn't formally adopted by all the states because it had to be unanimously agreed to, and that wasn't done until March of 1781. So the war went on and on for years without a formal government running things, and in 1781, of course, is the year of the Battle of Yorktown. So the Articles gets in at the good part, at the big victory, and then that government this treaty lasts until the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. So it lasts officially from 1781 until 1789, when the new government under the Constitution comes into effect.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you may notice that you can see my face right now. We're excited to announce that we are releasing full episodes with video on our YouTube channel, Primary Source Media. So make sure you subscribe there if you'd like to see how confused I look most of the time, or see the log cabin that Lynn lives in. Anyway, back to the convo.
So what is it? Is going to be your next question, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much, because it is definitely something that gets skipped over. To be honest, I, until this conversation, had no idea that they were drafted at the same time as the Declaration of Independence. That's new information to me. But it makes sense that was more important.
Think about it, though, Isaac, because here's the situation. It's like, we're going to declare independence, but what are we becoming?
Right.
And that was kind of one of the things that delayed that vote on independence. Was, shouldn't we establish some sort of more formal government and then declare? So there's a lot of moving parts going on. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and I guess the declaration is more of a press release than anything else, and then the articles actually are doing something. Right?
It should be studied in media classes. It's a brilliant press release. I know you've already talked about the Declaration, but it is exactly that. It's a press release that keeps on giving too.
Right. So there's a particular name for this. I think we can get into what is actually in the articles and specificity, but there's a title for this period that I think it's important for us to talk about so people know. It's called the critical period. Could you give us some insight as to why it was critical, or it is critical?
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. So I actually just did an edited volume called Reconsidering the Critical Period with my colleague, Chris Pearl. And one of the critical period is a term of art invented by a particular historian, named Fisk, writing in the 19th century, to describe this period basically from the ending of the war for independence and the Constitution. So it was called the critical period. And so that was taken up by many, many historians. And Fisk had lived through the Civil War, and he said, of all the period in American history, this was the most critical, meaning in his case, it was critical because he thought it was a real astonishing thing that the country actually survived this period. It was so critical that if the right things hadn't happened, i.e. if a new constitution hadn't come along in the Constitutional Convention, then the country would have fallen apart. And it would have experienced what he called a European outcome, which in the middle of the 19th century, he meant a lot of warring independent nations that would essentially use up all their energy and population in fighting each other constantly, which his experience of Europe was in the mid-19th century.
Sure.
This is, and of course, everybody's experience of Europe would be that through World War II, essentially, that Europe had been a fight for control and power between these various large states and small states, for as long as anybody could remember. In fact, the British's whole policy was the balance of power of Europe, making sure that Spain or France didn't take over all of Europe, or then ultimately letting Germany take over all of Europe. And so it was a fight to make sure Europe didn't become controlled by one power. Whereas in the American case, Fisk is basically saying America creates this lasting union, the Constitution, which is a union of perpetual peace amongst these states in the United States, and so you don't have these massive ongoing wars. Of course, he says that we lived through the Civil War. That was one major thing, which is something that I think he thought would have happened many, many more times under the Articles of Confederation, because the Articles was a weak confederation, essentially a weak alliance. It claimed that it would be a perpetual alliance between the sovereign states who declared independence. But, I mean, you could say you're perpetual, but that doesn't mean it's going to last.
Right.
Right. And it's important to note that before the revolution, people were, they looked at their states sort of as their country. So they'd say, I'm a Virginian, I'm a Pennsylvanian, how important that was to their identity. So that, you know, they didn't say, I'm part of a, you know, United States. It's, I'm a Virginian.
That's right. And I don't think people called the United States by a single until well after the Civil War. I mean, the United States are versus the United States is. It was the Articles of Confederation that first called the United States, said this confederation will be called the United States. Because there's lots of confederations, right? So these guys are students of history and they're lawyers and they're interested in other kinds of confederacies that have existed. And they're mostly looking towards, like, you know, the Holy Roman Empire and the ancient Greek confederacies and the Hanseatic League. You know, the United Republic of the Netherlands was a confederacy of sovereign states. You know, so they have examples in mind when they're creating the United States. In fact, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, when John Adams publishes in Europe the charter of the Articles of Confederation, he has in that book a copy of the United Provinces of the Netherlands, was one of the models that he's comparing it to at the time, which is, you know, I think 7 provinces of Netherlands, which declared their independence from Spain back in the 16th century.
Right. Huh.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
yeah, of course. We've actually, we actually had worked with one of our researchers early on in a documentary project was Dutch, and did his thesis on the Dutch Patriots. So we're relatively familiar, weirdly enough.
Well, one of the most, this is a tangent, which I know you guys like to get into, but so one of the Motley's book, The Rise and Fall, the Rise of the Dutch Republic. I think it was The Rise of the Dutch Republic. A guy named, last name Motley. It's one of the most popular books in 19th century America. And in it, and he's describing the Dutch Revolt. He uses the American Revolution as sort of a counterpoint. Like he'll say, like, William of Orange was the George Washington of, you know, the Dutch Revolt, and so as a way for people to understand, like, their importance in that thing. But that comparison, that early comparison of the Dutch Revolt and the American Revolution was one of the things that people used to try to understand what the hell is going on.
For our listeners who aren't familiar, by the time the Civil War came around, there was no Dutch Republic. It had become a kingdom again, and it still remains one, weirdly enough.
Yes.
That is weird, yeah, because it was destroyed by Napoleon, who created one of these client states called the Batavian Republic, and then that ultimately was overthrown and turned into the kingdom of whatever it's called.
So if you're ever, in the Netherlands, they have a king. So when you say loose, and strong and weak, what does that actually mean in terms of a relationship between these political entities that were states at the time?
Well, that's a tough question, and a good question, because you're right. They're odd words to use, but essentially what I mean is that the central government, the central authority, doesn't have an ability really to coerce the participant states or the individuals of those states. So if you're a citizen of Virginia, the Articles of Confederation really can do nothing to you. It can't tax you. It can't enlist you. All that has to be mediated through the state itself. So the individual relationship to the Articles is pretty much nil. I mean, there's some provisions in there that says that you should have the same rights if you're a Virginian and you go to Pennsylvania, but there's really no way to enforce that. There's no judiciary. There's no executive power. There's no executive branch. There's really a very limited legislative authority as well. So the Articles really constrains what central authority there is to be about things like declaring war, sending ambassadors. I mean, it's going to establish, weights and measures. It's going to establish the value of gold. But it's not going to create a unified monetary policy or anything like that. It's going to allow the states to continue to basically do everything they've been doing as colonies under the British Empire, actually more power than as colonies. They're going to be proper independent states that can pretty much run their internal life completely without any influence from any outside power. So that's what I mean. It's loose in that sense. And we'll find during the critical period, so-called, it's very weak. It's unable to even enforce what the states are supposed and obligated to do under the Articles agreement.
It's just to, you said you sort of brushed over something that I wanted to point out. So the Articles are the reason we don't use a metric system. They established a system of weights and measures.
Yeah, it was the first group not to choose the metric system, and many others have chosen not to follow the metric system. Yeah, no. Well, Isaac, you're too young to know, but when I was growing up in grade school, they were preparing us all for the great change to metric, which was always just around the corner, and that's why we have those rulers that have inches on one side and centimeters on the other side. I mean, you're never going to find a ruler like that anywhere but in the United States. So.
Right. You don't know how many times I've asked Siri calculations of liquids and things like that now. And I guess you don't need to switch over.
Thank goodness for those.
The phone just tells me what I need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But the Articles can be blamed for many things, but I think not adopting the metric system is not quite one of them.
Okay. All right. Well, glad we cleared that up.
Yeah.
So it sounds like what you're saying is because of how loosely the Articles sort of attached all of the different states, if there was a debt, say from the war to pay back, it would be out of the goodness of the hearts of each state to offer up what they want to, essentially. So like instead of just paying your taxes, they'd say, can we have some money? And you'd say, all right, I'll give you this much.
That's
and so,
right.
of course, it's hard to raise a lot.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Articles of Confederation say, that the obligations of the United States would have to be paid, and that the requisitions from the states will be decided upon by the representatives of the states that would meet in Congress. But enforcing it became really impossible. There was no way to enforce it. So it wasn't a real tax. It was literally an alliance. Like NATO, where certain member states of NATO are supposed to pay a certain amount of their budget every year to cover, the expense of NATO, but they don't do it. They don't always do it. And similar situation here, like the Congress that meets has representatives from every state. Now, no less than 2 from each state, no more than 7, but they only get 1 vote. So that's the other thing. So the Articles Congress, basically, each state has an equal vote, but you can send up to 7 people, but the state has to pay for their time, when they're doing their work. And so that Congress would meet and it would come up with a policy, say, okay, we're going to spend this amount of money on the Army this year. And each state would be divided up what they were owed based on their population and their wealth. And we'll get into this because this is important. This is so, how do you know, like Rhode Island's a tiny state. Obviously, they don't have to pay the same amount that Virginia has to pay. It's a massive state. And so the Congress would decide who has to pay what. And then if the state doesn't pay it, what do? You ask them to pay it the next year. You ask them to pay it the year after that. So what happens after the war is over, now the war is, once the war is won, it becomes harder and harder to get the states, to send representatives to it in a timely fashion. In many cases, they don't even have enough states, so they can't do any business. It becomes very hard to amend the Articles because one of the things they need to try to get is this taxation power. This is fundamental. Any government of its worth its salt can tax people and raise a revenue to do the things that it's trying to do, like pay the army. Right. And so the Articles of Confederation it goes on to show that it's very, very weak at getting these monies in. What it's good at doing is it's good at creating a forum for all these different colonies to come together and to solve some intractable problems that, that don't require a ton of money immediately, at least. Like who's going to get to share in Western lands? All the colonies have got these claims of Western lands going back to their royal charters or whatever. And so now all of a sudden the United States as a whole, some of these states have land claims, some don't. This becomes a forum whereby these colonies can agree to give up their claims, give them up to the whole, give them up to the United States. So Virginia, for instance, has land claims, that go to the Mississippi River. It's all the Ohio Valley. It's all this stuff. Virginia ultimately, through the working of the Articles of Confederation, gives up a lot of these land claims to create the first, federal territory. And the Articles of Confederation has to govern those federal territories. So the Northwest Ordinance, for instance, is one of the things that is created under the auspices of the Articles, which is really brilliant and probably one of the most important pieces of legislations ever created, because it creates a process of settling that territory. Of course, forgetting any Native American claims. I mean, that's, that they don't have much interest in that, except for, it has to be done by treaties negotiated by the United States of America. But the Northwest Ordinance forbids slavery in the area north of the Ohio River. It provides a process whereby the land can be settled, and also a process whereby the people in that territory can write their own constitution and then become a part, ultimately, to the Articles of Confederation. They can come on as a state, as a free and equal state. That's a really revolutionary and transformative moment, because it ends slavery in Northwest Ohio, which is crucial. We'll talk about that, I think. But also providing a way that you're not creating colonies, you're creating the potentially new free and equal states. That's something the British Empire never figured out how to do. If they had simply figured that out, there might not have ever been a Revolutionary War.
Yeah, that must have been relatively novel, because there's no models to look at that. It's not like the Holy Roman Empire or any of those things functioned in that manner. It's interesting.
That's right. You got to go back to ancient stuff and random examples of when Syracuse was made part of some Greek confederacy or something, which happened. I mean, it's got the name for it, but it was really novel in the 18th century. But it was adopted. It was one of the first pieces of legislation adopted by the new Congress under the Constitution. The Northwest Ordinance was made part of the American Code, essentially, moving forward. And it was a system which allowed the United States of America to ultimately dominate the continent, because they could settle areas without the problems of colonies. These areas would be settled, and then they would write a constitution, they'd petition to come in, and they would come in ultimately to the United States as states, as equal states. And it really was a remarkable willingness to spread out power, because most people don't want colonies to have the same power as the mother country, because they're colonies. I mean, if we ever send people to Mars, you want to make them equal to Earth. I mean, no, come on, it's just a bunch of Martians.
Yeah, that's this is going to get into a very different kind of audience, but that's the entire plot of the anime Gundam. I mean, I don't know if
I don't know that, but yes, it could be. But it is really a remarkable thing. We take it for granted, but obviously, these people would move there, and then they'd become the state from the former territory. I mean, that's not obvious. It wasn't obvious to any European empire that sent out colonies. They never figured it out. So
right.
You mentioned something about amending. So obviously that's actually cool to learn that there's something good that came out of the Articles, as opposed to just getting totally hey, they were terrible and we needed to get those papers out of there.
We won the war. We won the War of Independence under the Articles, so that's a pretty big notch for the Articles. They're 1-0. They had no losses.
And they retired up like it's champions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You hang up the jersey. That's exactly right. Yeah.
But you mentioned a word, amend, right? It was very difficult to amend. Was there a methodology? Because obviously that's a big part of the Constitution, being able to add things to it. Was there a method for amending the Articles? And you said it was difficult.
There was, and the amendments to the Articles initially required unanimous votes to amend.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah.
And that's why they couldn't
That's
get the
tough.
taxation power ever put in there.
Yep.
Now, there were some kinds of later, some articles that they could amend with 9 votes out of 13. And that was a change that was agreed to make an easier to amend. And that gives a model for when the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution is drafted, being aware that there's going to be a need to amend this thing. And, the amendment process should be hard, but not impossible, I think was the thinking there. And it's gotten harder, I think, than they intended it to become. There was an effort to get a tax provision passed, which would have been an opportunity to accept customs duties, right? So, and the problem was the Port of New York, received a massive amount of customs duties, because ships would come into New York, but they're not coming into New Jersey, say.
Right.
And so state of New York did not want to give up the revenue of customs that are coming into the Port of New York. And so there was an effort to amend the Articles of Confederation, and ultimately it was vetoed by New York. So it couldn't be done. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton, thought about leading a movement to secede the city of New York from the state of New York, so that that the Confederation could ultimately get that revenue. And that ultimately was played out again in the ratification debates over the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Hamilton was saying, look, the Constitution had already been ratified at that point by 9 states out of the 13 that were required, which was written into the new Constitution. And Hamilton was saying, if New York State doesn't ratify the Constitution, they would separate the port out, the city of New York out, and join the Constitution that way. So this fight over the ports and who controlled the revenue of the ports was a critical thing in that early period. Anyway, so the Articles could never get past the finish line on an amendment to be able to collect taxes, and that led to all sorts of challenges in the critical period in the 1780s.
Somebody obviously thought that it wasn't working, because when they decided to have what we now call the Constitutional Convention, they were actually just gathering to fix or amend the Articles.
There was obviously something wrong. So I'm curious, actually, how do we get to the point of that convention? Because, the Constitutional Convention is something that, everyone's, maybe not everyone, but most of our listeners have heard of and are relatively familiar with. But, they get basically like, we got to do something. Was it that same group of guys that are representing the states for the Articles? Is a different group of guys? How did that play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's so James Madison, early on, who we all know now is called the father of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. But he was a delegate from Virginia to the Congress, the Congress of the Articles of Confederation Congress, so basically the legislative body. And he basically said the thing was a weak and failing remnant, and that by 1784, so right after the war, because people weren't even showing up at the Congress to do the business of Congress. And what was happening, Madison would go on to write something called the Vices of the Political System, which is essentially a catalog of problems that had been happening in the 1780s. And they ranged from, of course, an insurrection in Massachusetts, which couldn't be put down without, basically the states voluntarily organizing themselves. There was no federal army. There was no way to raise an army. So you had, an insurrection. But along the way, you saw all sorts of things, like states would be passing laws, massive amounts of laws that they wouldn't enforce the laws that they passed. So essentially becoming what we would call banana republics, these republics that, create laws and then they never enforce laws. The power of taxation in the states would essentially pass money bills. So essentially they would print money to pay taxes. They would inflate the different dollars in the different states. Like Rhode Island was the worst of these. They would just print money over and over again, and they would make all debts payable in this new thing. So they were destroying the value of property from the perspective of people who owned property. From the people who wanted property, it was great. And debtors, because they wouldn't have to pay their debts in anything but this inflated currency. The borders of the United States could not be maintained at all because there was no army. no army that could be paid for. The treaty provisions under the Articles of the end of the war could not be enforced. So the British still actually owned a number of forts in what was, legally by treaty, the United States. But in fact, the British Army were still camped basically there in Detroit and in other places in the Ohio Valley. There was no way to have any good trade agreements with any states in Europe. So, for instance, a lot of the commerce of New England states was selling things to the West Indies. Well, the British wouldn't allow that to happen anymore after independence because the British had a mercantile system, and they're not going to allow foreigners to trade in their colonies. And these New Englanders, all their business had been basically developed within the British Empire, was now sort of collapsing and falling in upon itself. And so you had a flight also of gold out of the United States to Europe. And so the economy in the United States was collapsing, and there was no way to revive it, essentially. And all these things are happening sort of simultaneously. And, and it's everybody who's interested in improving the Articles comes at it from a different direction. Some of them are more concerned about the debt crisis. Some of them are more concerned about the lack of ability to raise taxes. Some of them are concerned about the lack of a foreign policy that makes any sense. And George Washington, from his vantage point, he thinks that everything is starting to verge towards what he calls anarchy and chaos. And that is that's kind of the perspective of what we'll call the Federalists. This is a name they gave themselves because they're interested in what they call federal matters. They're not interested in local matters and local prejudices, which is what they consider the states to be obsessed with. So when they say federal, they mean the Articles of Confederation, the federal system. That's the area we need to think more federally. We need to think about our union. We can't focus solely on what's only impacting our local states. So these Federalists, to get to your question, Isaac, are the ones that are really leading the charge to improve the Articles of Confederation. Really, as Lynn said, to think about ways to amend it was the first way people were thinking about it.
Right. So how did we go from that? How did we go from amending to let's just throw it out? Let's just do something different.
The road, as everything, goes right through Mount Vernon. It's the Mount Vernon Compact is the first step along this challenge. So, so what are you talking about? What is that? Well, George Washington becomes president of a company called the Potomac Navigation Company. That James Madison gets the piece of legislation passed through Virginia. Another person gets it passed through the state of Maryland. And they create the first corporate entity that's incorporated in two states in the United States. It's called the Potomac Navigation Company.
Oh, wow.
And the point of the Potomac Company is to improve the navigation of the Potomac River into the Ohio Valley. So to improve it means they're going to take out boulders, they're going to take out trees, they're going to dredge it. And in areas where, there's like the falls of the Potomac, the Great Falls, they're going to create a big canal system to go around the falls. So it's a company that's raising money and selling shares in this company to improve the Potomac, the navigability of the Potomac. George Washington believes this is the solution to the crisis of the West. All these people have moved west of the Appalachian Mountains. What's going to happen to them? They got no connection to the people in the East because all their rivers flow to the Mississippi, which is controlled by the Spanish. Or all the rivers can go up to the Great Lakes, which is controlled by the British. So how do you make sure these Americans who move west don't just become Spanish or become British? Well, they got to have some kind of economic tie to the East. And that's the idea of the Potomac Navigation Company. Wonderful. But the problem is the law is very unclear in terms of who controls the Potomac. Maryland has got jurisdiction over a lot of it, but not all of it. And then if you got crime on the Potomac and commercial differences on the Potomac, what is the legal authority? So the state of Maryland and the state of Virginia call for a convention of the two states to meet in Alexandria, which George Washington, in his sneaky, wily way, he makes them meet at Mount Vernon. And those commissioners from each state are here at Mount Vernon. And George Washington's like looking over their shoulder. He's not a commissioner. He's the president of this company. And they hammer out the rules, the legal rules by which the convention, by which the two states would deal with issues related to the Potomac. And it's a great success. And so it's such a success. One of the commissioners was, of course, James Madison. They say, well, let's get a bunch of states to do the same thing about all their trade issues, and we'll meet next year in Annapolis, in Maryland. And that's the Annapolis Convention, which only 6 states go to, but one of the people who goes to it is Alexander Hamilton, and one is Madison. And they say, well, this is a bust. There's not enough people here to really get anything done. So let's meet next year in Philadelphia, but let's also talk about amendments to the whole thing. And so that's the origins of the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. It comes right out of George Washington's company, the Potomac Navigation Company, and the Mount Vernon Compact. So that's it. So they go to Philadelphia with a bunch of ideas of how to revise this.
Gotta love the gumption of a group of guys who try to do something one year and don't accomplish it, and are like, you know what? We got to aim higher. We got to do. We should be trying to do more.
Yeah, Isaac, it's exactly right, because Annapolis was just supposed to be like a meeting to talk about trade, and Philadelphia obviously becomes something much, much bigger.
Yeah. That's fine. I don't know why this is tracking back a little bit earlier in our conversation, but when you're saying after independence, New England wasn't able to trade with the West Indies. I don't know why it reminded me of. I don't know if you've seen The Office, but when Michael Scott leaves to start his own paper company, it reminded me a little bit of like that. Like, oh, how do we? Great, now we're independent. What are we supposed to do now? Oh,
yeah, we're shocked. You're treating us like foreigners.
Yeah, right.
Basically said we're foreigners.
Right.
Yeah, it's the old. I'm surprised. I can't believe I'm being affected by the consequences of my decisions.
Right, exactly. So that paints a pretty good picture of how we got there to the convention in Philadelphia. But at the convention, they still showed up to just amend. Yeah,
well, and in fact, and it was a legitimately legal arrangement, because the Congress of the Articles of Confederation approved of the meeting in Philadelphia to propose amendments, limited approval, to propose amendments to the Confederation, because the idea was like, look, we can't do this at one of our regular meetings. We got the Northwest Ordinance. And the fact is, nobody ever comes to these meetings. So we got to call a special meeting of the eminent men of America to come to Philadelphia. And everybody knows, my God, we got to get George Washington there, because if he shows up, then everybody will show up, and it will look like it's a real deal. He didn't go to Annapolis, so you only got 5 states, and that was always part of the issue with it. Now, Washington himself, as you know, he famously resigned his commission. He's not going to do any public work anymore. And so he doesn't want to do this. He's like, his mom is sick. He's got to do that. The crops,
he's got stuff to do.
Yeah, he's a farmer.
I don't want to do this. My reputation is pretty spotless. Why would I want to do this? It sounds like a mess. But he is hearing all these reports about Shays' Rebellion. I mean, stuff's falling apart. Look at these crazy laws just passed by North Carolina. All these debtors are just going to be able to run wild. The people out west are doing whatever the hell they're doing. We got no way to enforce the treaty. It's a mess. We're not paying our obligations. We're not paying the soldiers what we owed them. And so, he starts to believe that, the whole 8 years of war are going to come to nothing. It's like, this is just going to be a disaster. We're going to end up back in the arms of some European power, or at each other's throats fighting a war. What was the point of all that suffering and sacrifice? And he says, look, I will come to Philadelphia, but it's got to be, we got to basically do the whole thing. We got to take a radical delousing of this situation. We got to bone the chicken. We got to do the whole thing. We're not just amending. Amending isn't going to do it. We need a whole new thing. And so he was one of the people pushing, if he was going to come out, let's go big or go home. That's kind of unique, because Washington's often portrayed as this old fart conservative type. But in fact, he really is saying, look, we got to fix this thing root and branch. And then let's do that. Let's not go and just throw a bunch of these small solutions at what's a huge problem.
Huh. Yeah, you can't put a Band-Aid on,
Yeah.
bleeding out here.
The malady was radical, and it would take heroic efforts to fix the patient.
So I think since we're talking about Washington and the convention, Lynn, I know we have some other lines of thinking we want to go down, but I would love to talk about the executive.
Yeah.
And just the idea of it, because it's so different from what's in the, like, it doesn't exist in the articles. And
That's right.
And like we were talking about, it's one of those things that is relatively novel in its construction at the time. But how did that come to be something that they realized they needed?
Yeah.
And as they're thinking about this, go ahead, Lynn.
If I could just jump in real quick, I think several historians have suggested that it was written the way it was because everybody assumed that George Washington was going to be the first president. So it was sort of what they were willing to trust George Washington with, not, looking forward, I guess, past George Washington's. And he was also the president of the convention. So he's also there while they're writing these things that they assume will be his job.
Yes, although Doug, I would love to say, now that Lynn has brought up that idea, and we did talk about his wiliness. This, and I won't ask a leading question. Was this him being wily in I want to be the guy to do all this stuff? And I'm looking over the shoulder of all of these guys that are setting up this thing. Is this an instance like that meeting at Mount Vernon where he was kind of maybe a little bit of a nudging in a particular direction?
Yeah, those are really, really good questions. George Washington is very difficult to pin down because he is a master politician. And so you could argue from outcomes and say, well, he went to this meeting and then they made him the president, so that's what he wanted. Mm-hmm. I think he also protested quite a bit about not wanting to be the president. We know that. He wanted to retire after 2 years as president. So it's a good question, and I don't know if I have a definitive answer for you. I do think he wanted a single executive, mm-hmm. Because there were other options and other things put forward during the Constitutional Convention. I think he would have had to be a fool to not know that once they were getting towards a single executive, that they were going to ask him to be the one. And in fact, that's what the framer from South Carolina, what's his face, says. We wouldn't have given the office of the presidency so much power if we had not had our eye fixed on the first one for that office. And even Franklin, when he got up to talk about the executive, people had a hard time talking about the executive because Washington's sitting right there. And Franklin said, look, we know the first one is going to be a great one of great integrity, but who knows what kind of clowns we're going to get after this. So we got to talk about it. Sure. We can't just leave it not to be talked about. So there definitely was that presumption around there. I think it probably crystallized for Washington in Philadelphia that was the direction. The reality is when they're going to Philadelphia, they're coming with the Virginia plan. And the Virginia plan calls for an executive, but it doesn't specify how that executive will be designed. And George Mason, George Washington's neighbor, is in the Virginia group that comes to Philadelphia, and he's advocating for a tripartite executive. Mm-hmm. And he's very loud about that. So I imagine he's probably out there saying, we're going to need a tripartite executive. You need a person, like a triumvirate, right? Like the great triumvirate of Rome, which worked out so great. They were constantly at war with each other. But, where you're going to have basically a council of three, one from each region, South, Middle Colonies, New England.
Gotcha.
And because that regional difference was so powerful and so much on people's minds in terms of how are you going to balance the interests of these different, if you're going to create a new government, you're creating a real government, not a treaty. You're creating a government that's going to have power to do things and enforce things. How are you going to do that when everybody's so different? From our vantage point of the 21st century, we're like, oh, they're a bunch of old white guys. They're all the same. No, they're very, very different. They're as different as, Boebert and Chuck Schumer. I mean, they're different. Right. They're different as rural and urban today. Yeah. Think of the most different politicians in our spectrum today. These are different interests that are at play here. And so they're trying to figure that out. And so, so who knows? But it is clear, over the course of time in Philadelphia that a single executive and a president, a single person is going to be designed to run the executive power, that Washington, it must have become very clear to him that's, he was going to be the guy that people wanted to be the first president. So, and you'd have to be a complete fool, which some people thought he was. I don't think he was a fool.
It's definitely a job that, invites a lot of critique. Like, he must have known his reputation might have changed. Yeah, being president.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess some people certainly wanted to be. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be president. There's lots of people who wanted to be president.
Oh, yeah. No, people want to be president, but at some level, if you're smart, you take that with a lot of hey, this is going to be tough.
I think Washington knew the challenges, and the deepness of the challenges that were there. So, at any rate, we've talked about him and the presidency, but in terms of the Constitutional Convention, he's there as he's president of the Constitutional Convention, which basically means he sits in the chair, the speaker's chair. He doesn't say much. He doesn't have a vote as president, but he has a vote as part of the group of the Virginia delegates. So each state, again, only gets one vote, but they have different numbers of people in their different delegations. And he will, during certain sessions, go down and sit with the Virginians and talk about things. And sometimes people say, well, he never said anything. At the very end of the thing, he advocates for a more democratic House of Representatives. That is to say, one representative for every 30,000 as opposed to 40 or 50,000. He also, Ed Larson wrote a book called The Return of George Washington, in which Ed makes the case that Washington is meeting with people in the evenings. He's meeting with different delegates regularly. He's having dinner with them, and he would often be seen to meet with somebody the night before would be the first person that he recognized who proposed one of the major compromises. So the series of compromises that have to happen throughout that summer in Philadelphia, Ed Larson as Washington sort of as the man behind the scenes orchestrating the compromises, because the one thing the guy in the chair does get to do is he gets to recognize who he wants to recognize to speak, who gets to speak first, who's had enough time, who gets to speak at all, who's got their hand up and you just don't see them.
Right. There's definitely an amount of power that comes with that.
Anyone not seeing anyone adjourn.
Right.
I mean, the speaker has some power in that regard. So it's hard to say some of that stuff. Ed maybe is a little more conspiratorial than I am, but Washington definitely had strong beliefs on what he thought the new government had to be. And that's what's interesting is he wasn't so much like Madison had specific outlines of, certain things that he wanted. Washington just wanted the government to be able to do certain things,
do stuff,
raise taxes, fund an army, deal with currency and the national debt, deal with the borders and foreign affairs.
That's that. They used so is it energy, Lynn? Am I remembering that correctly? Like political energy. They wanted the government to be able to do stuff.
Yeah, energetic central power. So it could, energetic meaning it could enforce the laws that they passed.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have all power. Like the Congress would be limited to do certain things, but the things that they were supposed to do, they were the ones that were making those decisions, and the states couldn't get in the way. The states had to be subservient to the central authority, and the central authority had to be energetic enough to enforce that law. So you see this in his own presidency, like the Whiskey Rebellion. The law is passed. It's an excise tax, on whiskey production that's passed by the legislature, and it's hated by huge chunks of the country, considered to be, unfair, unjust, the product of a bunch of rich asshats in, Wall Street, screwing the little man again. And they, and they're protesting it, and there probably was a bad law. But Washington, as the president, wanted an energetic government that could enforce that law. And the proper way to change the law was to have the legislature change the law. It wasn't to veto it in the streets, essentially. It wasn't using violence and insurrection. So he wanted an energetic government that could enforce the right things. But in terms of like the structure, he wasn't a constitutional thinker. in terms of like how many delegates and two houses and all that stuff. I mean,
Right.
that was
That's
more
right.
Madison's interest than some of the others.
Yeah, the little guy with all the ideas. leave
Yeah.
it to him. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Madison wanted a lot of things he didn't get, right? He wanted a
Right.
veto on state laws.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine? I mean, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of
He's going
laws
to read
to
all
go
those
through.
state laws.
There's some pretty wily state laws out there, pretty crazy state laws out there too. Yeah.
And he also wanted, right, he wanted representation by population in both houses.
Mm.
Right.
Oh,
And
that's
that was
So that was the first big compromise,
Huge
right? The first
argument,
big compromise was on you had the small state plan and the large state plan, right? So let's get into the juice of the matter here, right? So how do you represent? The articles had represented based on state. So each person, you could send 2 up to 7, but you only get 1 vote. So each state's
Right.
equal. It's basically
Right.
like the Senate. Each state, no matter how big, no matter how wealthy, no matter how important, no matter how smart the people in that state was, they all got the same vote as any other small rinky-dink state made up of maniacs, right?
Rhode
And
Island.
so it's hard. It's hard to give up. It's hard to give up power, right? Virginia is the largest state by far, and it's Madison writes the Virginia plan. They want to have Virginia having more say than anybody else, because you're talking about real laws now. You could tax people, and you could do all kinds of things that are going to impact people's lives. You're like, well, we should have more say than anybody else because we come from this rich place.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So they work their way through all of these compromises and sort of figure out stuff. And I guess one of the culminating thing that happens here is, how do they get rid of is there a technical term for this, Lynn, that I don't know? Like, how do they, of the articles that were already existed, and how do they how do they transition?
So basically, so at the end of the convention, they've passed this Constitution, they've signed it, and George Washington writes a letter to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
As is sort of like a letter that appears in all the papers with the Constitution, because he's the president of the convention. Enclosed, please find this new Constitution that we created, based on your recommendation. Now, what then happened was, at the Congress, after the fact, the Congress was pressured by Madison, by others, basically to accept Washington's letter as legitimately something that they had authorized them to create. So basically, they're changing the record, right? So originally, Congress had just asked them to give us some suggestions for amendments, and they show up with a brand new government and the instructions of how to put it into place, which is, once this thing is ratified by 9 states, it goes into effect, without any reference at all to the Articles of Confederation government or any of that stuff. So basically, you could have you theoretically could have alternative governments, right?
Sure.
You could have one ratified by all the states, and then the Articles of Confederation just sort of rolling along over here, trying to survive. But what happened was that the Articles of Confederation Congress basically accepted the offering of Washington and said, yes, thank you for this. And once that goes into effect, we will be no more, And so that's essentially what happened. So the Constitution, was ratified over the next, whatever it was, 13 months or something, from the fall of 1787 to 1788, the end of 1788. And you ended up getting 11 of 13 states to ratify it before the first Congress under the Constitution. So they were called under the rules set by the U.S. Constitution, not by the Articles. They show up in New York, and then a month later, they inaugurate the president as the first president. Of course, he'd been elected by the new Constitution rules, the Electoral College. And then they show up, and they start doing things. And one of the first things to do is they bring on all the things that were passed by the Articles of Confederation that were of any importance, and either passed them as laws or they wrote different laws. And in this case, the big one was the Northwest Ordinance. And so then, that first Congress sets up the judiciary branch. It sets up the executive branch. It creates the government from the Constitution. and then at the end of that, they pass all the the resolutions that are ultimately going to become known as the Bill of Rights, the first amendments to the Constitution, which these amendments had been agreed to as part of the ratification process. So yeah, so it's pretty incredible. I mean, it really was a revolution in government, a revolution in politics, and the way things get done in America, done without any bloodshed.
Yeah.
And it's an extraordinary achievement, really, to do it, because we've been living under that Constitution now for, my God, what is it, 2024? Do the math, since 1789.
Long time.
225 years.
So I know we're getting near the end, and time completely is flying by. And I want to make sure we talk about one issue that I feel like comes up a lot, in recent history and present. And we talked at the beginning of the podcast about adding states. So bringing on different states, their territories, then their states. But we never talk about losing states or states leaving. And this idea of nullification and states being able to look at a federal law and say, we don't agree, we're not going to follow that.
Right.
So can you give us an idea of what the founding fathers at that time thought of this idea of nullification and the federal law versus a state law?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the question. We could have spent the whole time talking about this.
Yeah.
Lynn.
For sure.
This is all government ultimately is based on people agreeing to the rules. This is why norms are important. When people violate norms and say things like, "Oh, I don't agree with you. I was actually elected." This is bad, because the reality is ultimately you don't have mechanisms to stop people from disobeying the rules that in constitutional crises. This happens when you have a government like ours, which the Constitution purports to be a federal arrangement between states which have given up aspects of their sovereignty and independence. But the states, not all aspects. In fact, the Constitution says certain things are retained by the states. It enumerates and limits certain power. And of course, our Supreme Court, as the ultimate arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution, has issued all kinds of verdicts on these issues throughout time and takes on more and more of a role. In the founding period, the idea of if Congress passed a law that a state didn't like, there were a lot of different ideas about what to do about it. The first ideas, driven by really the opposition to the Alien Sedition Acts, though there's some earlier examples, was James Madison himself working with Thomas Jefferson, working through the states of Virginia and Kentucky, to say that these laws were unconstitutional, and therefore they were null and void. And in their case, they were saying essentially that the federal government did not have the power to infringe upon the rights of individuals, in this case, the Sedition Act. And there was no criminal law, federal criminal law. There was no common law federally. This was a novel power. It's not granted in the Constitution. And so essentially, it's as if it never existed. So it didn't need like a formal process. It was more of a political statement, that this didn't exist. And in that sense, it's connected more to the way the Americans opposed the Stamp Act that the British passed. So they're basically saying, you don't have the right to pass this because we don't have representation. No taxation without representation. And in the Jeffersonian case, you don't have the right to pass these laws because the Constitution doesn't give you that right, and the federal government cannot violate the natural rights of individuals in this way. That's what the Kentucky Resolution said, which Jefferson wrote. Now, that's very different from what the nullifiers of the Calhoun era say. Now, Calhoun will look back to the Jeffersonian guys and say, we're doing what they did. But in fact, what Calhoun argues is that any state has the sovereign right to oppose any law that the federal government passed if they don't like it, that they have a nullification power that is because they're sovereign, and so they could overturn anything. Now, that was Madison, who was still alive when this is happening, said that's absurd. That's not at all what we were saying. because basically what you're saying is there's a legitimate tariff law passed by the government, which has the power to pass tariffs. And you're saying any state can just overturn
Right.
that because they're a state. That, that nullification movement and constitutional movement actually was an argument that the old Federalists used to make in the Hartford Convention effort. In fact, if you look at Calhoun, he went to Yale, right? And Yale's president at the time he was there was Timothy Dwight, and Timothy Dwight was the president of the Hartford Convention, which almost seceded from the Union during the War of 1812. So it's those Yaleys is the problem, not the good old Jeffersonians at Virginia are not the problem. It's the Yaleys always causing trouble in this case. But yeah, you're right, though. I mean, it's sort of like the Union is supposed to be perpetual. It says it's perpetual. The states do not. The states do not have authority to pass judgment on tariffs.
Right.
But what when you get into these questions of human rights and natural rights, it gets it gets really fraught. And we, in our day and age, the Supreme Court has become this sort of arbiter between these issues. But you could imagine a time where these states have tried, obviously in the Civil War, tried to secede and claimed they had a right to secede from this union. And it is, on the one hand, the states existed before the Constitution, right? The states agreed to the Constitution. So
Right.
somehow you think, well, I guess if the states agreed to the Constitution, they ought to be able to say, okay, it ain't working for us anymore. We're out. See you later. We'll take the consequences of our actions.
Sure.
But, I don't. That is not what was intended by the More Perfect Union. That's for sure. And even the articles, as I said that this is a perpetual union that these states have been involved in, and certainly, the territories that existed before any state that's not one of the first 13 probably shouldn't have any conceptual, theoretical right to secede, except maybe Texas.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's some people who argue.
Federal territories before they were states, so you can't really get out of that conundrum, it seems to me. But
Once you're in, you're in. Yeah.
But then you have the right of revolution, I guess, which all people have, which our founders clearly believed in. So
Right.
they ultimately split from Great Britain. And it's always been the challenge. It was a real challenge in Latin America, right? It's like, how do you go from, how do you keep these people from just declaring independence?
Right.
The Union of Gran Granada, which Bolivar was trying to set up, Colombia, all these states basically that are coming out of the Spanish Empire as it's collapsing. They tried to create Gran Granada, but then you have independence movements and civil wars and spin-offs, in part because they're not strong enough to hold them together. I mean, ultimately, if the Union Army didn't win the Civil War, they would have seceded, and then you probably would have had secessions that come after that, right? Because once it happens once, I mean,
Right.
it's
How legitimate
harder
is the
for
claim to
people-
hold it together?
It's like, are we really going to fight to keep Oregon now? I mean, it's like all these people died to try to keep the South, but now all these people in the crazy Northwest are trying to secede from the East. And I mean, who knows what would happen? I mean, that was what Fisk was worried about. I mean, Fisk was worried ultimately that, the logic of independence is just going to, it's just going to keep going. It is unique. United States is unique, I think, in the sense of such a large country with such a strong, belief in the spirit of liberty, and yet able to hang together. What are we hanging together for, and why? I mean, the Union. Washington had always argued that the Union is the only thing that assures our independence and our freedom. Mm-hmm. Because once you start separating out, you lose a lot. You can become quite weak. In fact, and the world is not a safe place for independent small states yet. Just look at the Ukrainians. And their struggle.
That's very true.
You take these things for granted in times of peace. It's like, what do we need this union for? It's made up of a bunch of maniacs. And they're worse scenarios too.
Yeah, God knows what the Canadians would do to us if we all split up, went our separate ways.
I wouldn't trust them with my back to them.
But it's notwithstanding how serious the conversations these days are about nullification and secession and all of that, because I think they have varying degrees of seriousness to them. But I do think this was an incredibly thoughtful walk through the document that they're all talking about, so that the creation of the Constitution and why it exists the way it does and why it is as strong as it is, and that's a great answer to what we're doing. Why
it's an imperfect solution to the challenge of governing in a representative form a very diverse, very self-interested, dynamic population over a vast territory. The territory is less vast than it was then, in the sense that I can go see you tomorrow, Isaac, if I had the interest or the time. But we can have this conversation now. I mean, communication's instantaneous. In their time, to be able to mutually govern and feel like you're part of something when when you're so far flung and far afield, it was really remarkable, the scale that they were able to create something that lasted that long. And I think now we are suffering from the fact that we do have instantaneous communication. And we, in some ways, young people want a real nation, in the sense that we don't have different states that got all these weird arcane powers that were given them because they were necessary to get people to be willing to work together. People want, they want justice, and they want it right away, and they want it based on these set of principles that obviously are the best set. And it's, we're not that kind of nation, we're really not. And so that patience has always been built into our crazy system, which requires all sorts of compromise. It requires just to be willing to have, a state of 500,000 people having the same amount of power as a state of 60 million people, or whatever the hell, California is now, or Texas. I don't know how much you are, but
who knows?
Feels like it's like that. It's not a democracy in that it's not a direct democracy, certainly. I mean, its ethos is democratic, and the idea that the people will rule, and it's supposed to be representative, and that's changed over time of who's being representative and who can be considered as an American. And what's astonishing is that we still have the same Constitution that had a very different set of ideas about race and gender and class, disability. I mean, all sorts of things. It would be
unrecognizable, even as far as economics go. They wouldn't recognize it at all. And I think you pointed out one thing that's really, really a useful thing, especially when people are frustrated. And it's easy, especially in election years where there's a lot going on that can be very frustrating. And post-election, obviously, there's a whole subset of the population that is frustrated. But the inefficiencies are a feature, not a flaw. And it's part of the reason why we're still putzing around, with that Constitution that's 200. I don't know if we've actually figured out the math. 200 odd some years old at this point. This is a history podcast, not a math podcast. Damn it.
230. 230.
That's impressive. Yeah.
So, it is just of everyone's time and the listeners. Obviously, we can have, if you so choose, reach out to us. And if you'd like to have Doug back to talk a little bit more about another subject,
give me an upvote. Come on. We're just getting started here. I feel like we're just about to get into it. Absolutely.
So
these folks don't even know that I interviewed you for a documentary for like 6.5 hours at one point. They don't know what they're in for if they ask for it.
Isaac, I'm ready for the reshoots anytime.
So obviously, we said at the beginning that you're the CEO over at Mount Vernon, the John and Adrian Mars, president and CEO of George Washington Mount Vernon. But how could people, if they're interested in your work, interested in Mount Vernon, how can they reach out, and how can they find you?
Well, I hope they visit us at George Washington's Mount Vernon, mountvernon.org, and become a member and support our mission of education and preservation of the ancestral home of George Washington. And we do all sorts of educational programs around the nation. So please check us out. We have our own podcast series, as well as all sorts of documents. You can spend years on our webpage reading some more. So enjoy.
That's great. You have several books if people look for you online as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, you can Google me and
There you
and
go.
dismiss all the bad things. You know, the interwebs are.
They're lies.
Well, we'll put some links in the description for some of Doug's books, as well as the links to Mount Vernon in general. But thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, but a
Thank
recent
you.
book on the critical period. You might find
Yes.
An
Yes.
engaging way to pursue some more
Very
questions
timely.
about that era.
Very relevant to today's
Absolutely.
conversation.
Yeah. Good. Wonderful.
Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.